All right, welcome. I am Dr. Stephen Lindner, and we are going to start the introduction to anatomy and physiology. And a really good place to start is looking at what is this term anatomy compared to physiology. Now, anatomy is pretty much looking at the structure of the human body, whereas the physiology is really looking at the function. So when we say anatomy and physiology, we're talking about structure and function, or form and function. Now, when we talk about anatomy, we're talking about what are the things made of? What is the body part made of? What is the bone made of? What is the muscle made of? What is the organ made of? Right? Where are they located? And all the different associated structures with that body part. But again, we're talking about structures. Whereas physiology, we're really honing in at the function of the structure, because every structure has a particular function. The way it's designed is going to determine how it functions. Now here we're looking at this young lady and we see that she's standing in a very particular way. She's standing with her feet flat on the floor. She's standing erect. Her palms are facing forward. Or we could say her palms are facing anteriorly. Anterior means forward. It's facing forward. This is called anatomical position. It's a really important starting point for us. It's really important reference term because everything that we study and every directional term that we talk about has to be made in terms of this as the reference point. When we look at superficial anatomy, these are the structures that are located close to or at the body's surface. It doesn't need any type of microscope. It's macroscopic. We can see it with the naked eye. And again, it is close to the body's surface. When we talk about anatomical landmarks, this term anatomical position again refers to what we spoke about here, standing erect with the palms facing anteriorly or facing forward. These two terms, supine and prone, are also important. Supine is lying down, so is prone, right? So supine and prone are both lying down. However, supine is when you're face up, prone is when you're lying face down. So I like to come up with little simple, easy ways of remembering things. So supine is when you're lying on your spine. That means you're face up. Prone is when you're lying on your bone, like your nose, face down. Here in this picture, this has shown up in the past on some of the lab quizzes or lab exams. You see the person is lying face down. Well, face down is lying on the bone. The bone would be the nose, so that would be prone. If they were face up, as we see on the top picture here, the top one, they are lying on their spine, so they are supine. You see that they're lying face up, and supine is the opposite of prone. If we go to the bottom picture, all the way down at the bottom here, they are lying prone. They're lying on the bone, the nose. They're lying face down, and prone is the opposite of supine. Right in the middle, person standing erect, standing upright. Notice the feet are flat on the floor and the palms are facing ventrally or anteriorly, known as anatomical position. When we talk about anatomy, we have microscopic anatomy as well. Microscopic is now when we're examining things smaller than the naked eye. If we're talking about human cells or molecules, okay, these are smaller than the naked eye. When we study the human cell or cells, we call it cytology. When cells come together, they join, and they make tissues. The study of tissues and their associated structures is called histology. So cytology, cells, histology, tissues. Here we're looking at the level of organization, different levels. So we have things at the molecular level or the chemical level. When chemicals come together, they make up cells. When cells come together, they make up tissues. When tissues come together, they make organs. When organs come together, like the heart or the stomach and the kidneys, then they make the organism. I'm sorry, when the organs come together, they make systems. So if you were to have, let's say, the esophagus and the stomach and the small intestine and large intestine, right? So all of those organs are part of the digestive system. So there's an organ system. If we talk about the heart and the arteries and the arterioles and the veins, now we're talking about the cardiovascular system. So when you take all of those systems, like the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the immune system, the reproductive system, the respiratory system, the integumentary system, the urinary system, right? You take all of these systems and you bring them together, now we have the organism. So in this picture on the top left, if we start with number one, the chemistry, chemicals come together, whether they are carbons and hydrogens and oxygen and nitrogen and phosphates, they come together and then they form the cell. And then cells come together and they make up the tissues. And then tissues come together and make up the organs come together and make up systems, and then the systems come together and make up the organism. So now that I mentioned these systems, let's take a look at some of these systems. So on the top left, I've also seen this pop up on some of the lab quizzes before. So we're looking at the bones on the left. And when we look at the bones on the left, we have bones that are centrally located, like the skull, the spine, the ribs. They would call that the axial skeleton. And then the skeleton that's more in the periphery, like the upper extremity and lower extremity, like the humerus and then the radius and the ulnar and the fingers and then the femur and then the leg and the foot, that's called the appendicular skeleton. So skeletal system would be correct, but if we wanted to be more specific, if we're talking about the skeleton that is centrally located, we call that the axial skeleton. And when we talk about the skeleton outside of the central part, it is the appendicular skeleton. Moving to the second picture where it says nervous system, that is the brain, the spinal cord, and the associated nerves. Now, the nervous system can be broken down into a central nervous system, they call it the CNS, and a peripheral neural system called the PNS. So what you see in the middle, the brain and the spinal cord, and that's it, that would be called the central neural system. All of the nerves that come off of the spinal cord, that would be peripheral neural system, or PNS. Let's look at the third picture in the middle, the respiratory system. So everything from the nose and the airways and the upper respiratory tract, and then the bronchi and the lungs, all of that is respiratory system. And when we get into the respiratory system, we'll see we can divide that into an upper respiratory system, which is everything from the larynx up. And then there is a lower respiratory tract, which is everything from the larynx down into the alveoli, into the deeper part of the lungs. Fourth picture to the right, we're looking at the heart and all the associated blood vessels that go up to the brain, to the shoulder, down to the hands, down from the heart to the stomach and to the lower extremity, circulatory system. Off to the right, the last picture to the right, we see the kidneys, we see the two ureters, and then we see the urinary bladder to the center. And then distal to the urinary bladder would be the urethra. So two terms that you shouldn't confuse are ureters and urethra. Easy way to remember the difference: the word ureters have two E's, and you have two kidneys. So off of each kidney, there's that long tube from each kidney called a ureter, and that goes to the urinary bladder. So two kidneys, two ureters, but from the urinary bladder to the exit route urinating out the urine, whether you're male or female, you have one urethra. Easy way to remember it. The digestive system on the left, there's the mouth, and then there's the esophagus, there's the stomach, there is the small intestine, there's the large intestine. Those are the main digestive parts. And then there are accessory organs like the gallbladder and the liver and the pancreas. Those are digestive parts, but they're not primary. They're like accessory organs. Okay. Second picture to the right, integumentary. That is the skin, the hair, the nails, everything on the outside of the body is the integumentary system. And it should get a lot of attention because it's the first line of defense to your immune system is the skin and the hair and the nails. It keeps things outside of the body. Okay. Third picture is the endocrine system. These are a bunch of glands that make up the endocrine system, and these endocrine glands can secrete or release hormones into the bloodstream. And these hormones tell other body parts to perhaps turn on or turn off, or to speed up or to slow down. And we'll get into the endocrine system in the upcoming weeks. But it is a major player along with the neural system in controlling all of the bodily functions. The neural system uses a chemical messenger called neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system uses a chemical messenger called hormones. In the brain, there's the hypothalamus and the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. In the throat, there's the thyroid gland. In the chest, where the sternum is, there's the thymus. Then we see in the abdominal area, we see two kidneys and we see a pancreas. So the kidneys and pancreas, they also release and secrete hormones. And then when you look in this case reproductively, here the male near the scrotum or the testes, and they too produce a hormone, testosterone. Fourth picture, we're looking at the muscular system. When we talk about muscles, we have three types of muscle in the human body. What we're looking at here in this picture is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle attaches to your skeleton and is voluntarily or consciously controlled. It's voluntarily or consciously controlled. The other two types of muscle are cardiac and smooth. So they are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Those are the three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Cardiac refers to the heart, and smooth muscle refers to your viscera, your organs, like a woman's uterus is lined with smooth muscle. A woman cannot voluntarily contract the uterus. During that time of month, when a woman is menstruating, there may be smooth muscle contractions. During labor, there are smooth muscle contractions. Arteries, blood vessels, they can contract, they can constrict or dilate. That's what makes your blood pressure go up and down. If your blood vessels or your arteries are constricted due to smooth muscle contraction, blood pressure goes up. When they relax and they dilate, blood pressure goes down. Your trachea, your windpipe has smooth muscle around it. When it constricts, you get wheezing or like asthmatic-like symptoms. Your intestines, like your large intestine, has smooth muscle around it. It can constrict, and if it's too constricted, you're constipated. If it's too much dilated, then you have loose stools or diarrhea. Okay, so that's a little bit about the muscular system. And then the lymphatics over to the right, you can see that you've got your lymphatic vessels there along the cervical spine and the neck, behind the ear, in the chest, in the armpit called the axilla. Then you have the spleen, you have the inguinal lymph nodes. There's lymph nodes in the arm, in the leg, and near the breast tissue, everywhere. It's the filtration system. It's designed to return healthy, clean, clear liquids back into the body. Okay, so when we talk about the integumentary system, as we mentioned earlier, we talk about the skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, and it's designed to protect us against environmental hazards, right? Keep whatever's outside of the body on the outside, keep what's inside the body on the inside. Skin and hair helps to regulate our body temperature, and it also provides sensory information, right? If a little insect is crawling on your arm, we have enough sensory receptors to detect that. When we talk about the skeletal system, we're talking about bones, cartilage, ligaments. Ligaments hold two bones in alignment with each other. This is probably a good place to differentiate what is a ligament and what is a tendon. So ligaments go from bone to bone. It holds two bones in alignment. Tendons, on the other hand, are the extension of muscle. Tendons are the extension of muscle. Now, muscles contract and they transmit that contractile force to the bone to make it move. But how does it transmit the contractile force to the bone to make it move? Well, muscles attach to bones by way of tendons. Okay? So that's the difference between ligaments and bones. Cartilage is that buffer or that cushioning that separates two bones from one another. So you have cartilage between your knee, you have cartilage between your shoulder, cartilage between your hips. And if that cartilage breaks down and degenerates, in severe cases of arthritis, people get severe pain in those joints. And that's when they come up with knee replacement or hip replacements. So the skeletal system provides support and protection for other tissues. Look at the skull for an example. The skull protects the brain. Is there any other organ in the body that's fully protected? The brain is protected by the skull. Maybe the heart is protected by the ribs, but the ribs aren't full solid bone. We have spaces between each rib, but the skull is like a helmet that protects the brain. That's why we know it's super important. Just like the spinal column. The spinal column is made up of 24 freely movable bones, 7 in the neck, those are called cervicals, 12 in the mid-back, those are called thoracic vertebrae, and 5 in the lower back, those are called lumbars. So we have 7 cervicals, 12 thoracics, 5 lumbars. The way you can remember that is you eat at 7 a.m., 12 noon, and 5 p.m. You eat at 7 a.m., 12 noon, 5 p.m. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. Those 24 freely movable vertebrae protect the spinal cord. So the CNS, the central neural system, the brain and spinal cord, is completely protected by the skeletal system. The bones store calcium and other minerals, so it's like a reservoir, a mineral reservoir. It's like a bank that stores things, and it's involved in the formation of blood cells. It forms red blood cells, and it forms white blood cells. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes, and white blood cells are called leukocytes. Here, let's look at the highlighted blue section. What do you think the best answer there is? Let's take a look at the choices. Is it the appendicular skeleton? Actually, the appendicular would be everything that's tan. This would be your last choice, the axial skeleton. Okay. Muscles. We told you the 3 different types of muscles. Here we're talking about not cardiac, we're not talking about smooth, we're talking about skeletal muscle here. Skeletal muscles, when they contract, they provide movement for us. They also generate heat. Think about it, when the body is cold, you shiver. In the Northeast, where I'm currently from, in the winter time, it gets pretty cold. It could be 2, 3, 4 degrees here sometimes in the winter. And when you go outside, after a while, you can go, your teeth start to chatter. It's because when muscles contract, they generate heat. We know when we exercise and our muscles are contracting, we get hot, so we sweat to cool us off. We know when someone has a fever, let's say 102, 103, 104 degrees, sometimes their body needs to go higher than that. So maybe it goes 106 or 107. When it does that, or let's say the body is trying to spike a fever, but it can't, that's when the eyes roll back and the muscles start to shiver in this febrile seizure. And during seizuring, there's very strong muscle contractions. The reason why the muscles are contracting are to generate more heat to help destroy and burn up any bacteria or virus to kill it. Okay, remember they thrive in the temperature of 97 or 98 degrees. So when the body spikes the fever, it's like turning on the internal incinerator to seek and destroy. Okay, so here we're looking at the muscular system. But now here, look what is highlighted. We're looking at the blue highlighted region of the upper and lower extremity. This is not pointing to what we see centrally, but what is out there in the periphery. So in the center, we have axial muscles, and in the extremities, we call them appendicular muscles, just like axial skeleton, appendicular skeleton. The appendicular refers to the upper and lower extremities. So these are the appendicular muscles. The muscles of the torso, neck, and head, these are called the axial muscles. When we talk about the neural system, you'll often hear me use the word neural and not nervous. When I'm talking to my patients, I also use the word neural and not nervous because I don't want my patients nervous. The neural system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. When we talk about what we see centrally, brain and spinal cord, that is the CNS, which is the central neural system. And then every nerve that comes off of the brain or every nerve that comes off of the spinal cord is called the peripheral neural system, or the PNS. The function of the neural system is to take in sensory input or sensory information. It processes that information and then creates some degree of motor output to a muscle, organ, gland, or tissue. So it takes in the information, it processes and interprets the information, and then sends out some sort of motor command throughout the body. So here in the highlighted blue region, what would we see right here? Is it responsible for removing waste? No. Is it connecting to muscles? Is it destroying invaders? This is the control center, the brain and the spinal cord. It is the first system that develops embryologically after sperm and egg come together. Somewhere around day 18 to 20, somewhere in there, is where the neural system starts to develop. It is the control center. It's Houston control, if you would. Endocrine system, the major players in the brain, we have the pituitary gland, we have the pancreas that's regulating blood sugar and also releasing digestive enzymes. The gonads would be the testes and the ovaries that produces sex hormones. The thyroid gland is in the throat, that is involved in producing T3, T4. T4 is thyroxine, T3 is triiodothyronine, and calcitonin. The adrenal glands, the adrenals, if you look at the word adrenal, we see two words there. We see renal, which is kidney, and then add. So we're adding something to the kidneys, and that's the adrenals, sometimes referred to as the suprarenal. Supra means above the kidneys. So the adrenals are involved in a lot of different functions. We'll go over them in a lot more detail when we do endocrinology. But in terms of functioning, the endocrine system, much like the neural system, is a control center. Here, it's directing long-term changes and activities of organ systems. It's adjusting metabolic activity, like your thyroid gland is adjusting your metabolism and how your body uses energy. It's also controlling many structural and functional changes during development. Here, we are looking at what is the blue structure just between the kidneys. That would be your pancreas. On the upper left, that box, it's the thyroid gland, but behind the thyroid gland on the posterior surface are those four circles, two on the left and two on the right. Those two on the left and two on the right, those are called parathyroid glands. And then down in the box on the lower left, we're looking at female reproductive. We see the uterus in the center. We see the fallopian tubes off of each side, also known as uterine tubes. And then those white things at the end of the fimbriae are the ovaries. Cardiovascular system, major organs of the cardiovascular system is the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. And the function of the heart is to really pump blood. When we talk about blood, we're talking about red blood cells. They carry hemoglobin, and hemoglobin has a heme portion, which has an iron-containing portion, and a non-iron-containing portion. Iron binds to oxygen. Well, that's why when people are iron deficient, or they have an iron deficiency anemia, they have no energy. They have fatigue, right? We need oxygen for fuel and for energy. So heart pumps, it's pumping red blood cells that are carrying iron bound to oxygen, or pumping oxygen that's bound to iron, whichever way you want to look at it, and is delivering that oxygen to the cells. We'll be covering the cells this week. When we look at the cell, there's a organelle that is referred to as the mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to use that oxygen to help break down glucose and to help formulate energy. And the energy currency of the body is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So the heart pumps, it's going to distribute blood cells, water, all the dissolved nutrients and materials. It's going to move oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body and even waste products. And blood is also utilized to distribute heat and assist in the control of body temperature. Here, the area that is highlighted blue is going to be the heart. We talk about the lymphatics. We're talking about the spleen, the thymus, your lymphatic nodes and lymphatic vessels, your tonsils. Primary function of the lymphatic system is to help fight infection, to defend against certain infectious diseases, and to filter out and return tissue fluids in a clean way back into bloodstream. In the respiratory system, we have the nasal cavities. We have your sinuses, your larynx, your trachea, your bronchi, lungs, and alveoli. And they're designed to deliver air or oxygen, right? It's going to deliver air to the deepest part of the lungs called the alveoli. And that's the site where gas exchange takes place, where oxygen comes in, but CO2 is pushed out. So it provides oxygen to the bloodstream, but removes CO2 from the bloodstream as well. And because of the sinuses, it produces sound for communication. Here, we are looking at the blue area, that is the upper respiratory tract. Right? You've heard of people that have upper respiratory tract infections, and then there are people that have lower respiratory tract infections. So if you want to know when someone has an upper respiratory tract infection, what structures are involved, just look at the blue region. Distal to that, right, from that larynx down would be lower respiratory tract. The digestive organs, teeth, tongue, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Where does digestion start? Most people say the mouth because you have your teeth there and your tongue and you have salivary enzymes. But if you think outside the bun, right, think outside the box, where does digestion really take place? If you think of grandma's cooking or mom's soup or something, you could just think about it, you could salivate. Think of Pavlov, right? Ringing the bell and the dog salivates, right? So digestion really starts with your thought. It starts between the ears. Think of most eating disorders. Do they start in the mouth or do they start in the brain? Most eating disorders are brain disorders, okay? So digestion really starts in the brain. The eyes take in information, sight, the nose takes in information for smell, takes it into the brain processes that information. Primary function of digestion, it's going to process, digest our food. It's involved in absorbing and conserving water, absorbing nutrients, and storing energy, right? It's going to utilize some of the vitamins and minerals for immediate energy. And that which the body doesn't need, it's going to put it in storage. And then if there's excess beyond that, that's what the body eliminates through urination and bowel movements. So here we're looking at the blue highlighted structure. That is the small intestine. Small intestine is made up of the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, those three parts. Duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, those three parts. That's the small intestine. Surrounding that in the blue, this is the large intestine. The large intestine on the left-hand side going up, that's called the ascending colon. And then the top part going across, that's going to be the transverse colon. And then going down, that's the descending colon. And then right down at the bottom, that is the rectum. Okay. Now we're looking at some parts of the mouth, looks like the tongue. Then we're looking at the liver, and it looks like part of the gallbladder and even pancreas. So there's multiple parts there. So it's not really pointing to the digestive tract. It's not, although it is pointing partly to the liver and it is pointing to the salivary glands, those things all together are the accessory digestive organs. They are secondary players in the game known as digestion. They are the accessory organs. The urinary system, we're talking about the kidneys, the ureter, the urinary bladder, the urethra. The function of the urinary system is to excrete waste products from the blood, right? The liver is filtering everything out. It's going to send all the waste and debris to the kidneys. The kidneys do more filtering, and that which the body needs, the body will reabsorb, and that which the body doesn't want, it will eliminate through urination. It's involved in controlling water balance by regulating the volume of urine produced. And it's also involved in regulating ion concentration, which helps to regulate pH, or percentage or potential of hydrogen, pH. The reproductive tract, we have the male and the female reproductive. For male, we have these parts, the testes, the epididymis, the ductus deferens, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, the penis, and scrotum. We'll get into these more detail later on when we cover the male reproductive tract. The functions is to produce the male sex cell, which is the sperm, the associated suspending fluids and hormones, and sexual intercourse. For the female reproductive, we got the ovaries, the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the labia, clitoris, and mammary glands. The female reproductive function is to produce the female sex cell known as the egg or the oocyte, as well as hormones. It's designed to support the developing embryo from conception to delivery, providing milk to nourish the newborn infant, and sexual intercourse. In terms of anatomical landmarks, and we can break these down into certain structures that are palpable, meaning you can touch and feel these areas, these landmarks. We'll talk about certain anatomical regions, certain body regions. We'll also focus on the 4 abdominal quadrants, and we'll talk about the 9 abdominopelvic regions. We'll also get into anatomical directional terms. So let's look at some of these anatomical regions first. So on the top in the center, we have the frontal portion, which is the forehead. And then as we move down, we have the nasal region for the nose. When we move lateral to the nose, we have the buccal or the cheek. When we move distal to that, we move to the mouth, which is the oral region. When we move distal to that, we're talking about the chin, which is known as the mental region. Lateral to the chin, that means moving away from midline, we could see off to the right where it says cervical or neck. So the neck region is the cervical region. When we move back to the center, but we move distally, we have the thoracic region, which is the chest. Then we move to the breast region, which is the mammary. When you look to the left, in the armpit, it's called the axillary region. So the armpit is known as the axillary region. That's important because there are axillary lymph nodes. There's an axillary artery, and an axillary vein, and an axillary nerve. When we look at the chin, where it's called mental, that's important because we get into osteology. There's something called the mental foramen, which is holes. The word foramen is a hole. So mental foramen is a hole in the lower jaw. When we do muscles, there's a muscle called the mentalis. When you get up to the forehead, there's a muscle called the frontalis. There's another muscle called the nasalis for the nose. Near the cheek, there's a muscle called the buccinator. So the word buccal for cheek, right? So understanding some of these terms are really important in understanding anatomical body parts. When we look at the arm, we see brachial for arm. So when we cover muscles, there's a muscle called the brachialis or biceps brachii. Let's see, what else do we have here? The belly button is umbilical, right? The stomach region is called the abdominal region. And all together, the belly button, right, the umbilical, the abdominal, the mammary, and the chest, all together, those areas are referred to as the trunk. Sometimes they'll call it the torso or the trunk. So here, this is shown up on some lab quizzes in the past. So these would be under like drag and drop. So drag and drop. So in front of the forehead is the frontal region. The ear is called otic. The cheek is called buccal. The chin is called mental. The nose is nasal. And the eye is orbital. And then in the throat, you can see there's an anterior cervical triangle and a lateral cervical triangle. The SCM muscle, or the sternocleidomastoid, is a boundary muscle that separates the anterior from the lateral cervical triangle. When we look at the lower half of the body, You can see on the left there where it says wrist, carpal. And the carpal bones, there are 8 carpal bones. I teach them when I do osteology, and I'll go through the 8 carpal bones, proximal and distal row. There's 4 in each row. Then you have the palm, the palmar region. Then you have the fingers that are called phalanges. And you have the thumb that's called pollex or pollicus. Now, if we skip all the way down to the foot is called the pedal foundation, like pedal, pedal. If we look at the ankle joint, the ankle is called the tarsal. Remember, the wrist is called carpal. At the foot, it's called tarsal. The toes, again, are called phalanges. But the great toe has its own unique name called the hallux or hallucis. So the great toe is the hallux or hallucis, but the thumb is called pollex or pollicus. Let's go up to the thigh. You can see that in the groin region, that line where you have the inguinal ligament is called the inguinal region. Then you have the pubic region, and then the thigh itself is called the femoral region. That's because the femur is there, the longest bone in the body. You have the kneecap in the middle, that's called the patellar. The kneecap is the patellar. The leg is the crural, and I think we've covered all of them. Again, little silly ways to remember things. If you look at the wrist, carpal, car, you see car because you drive the steering wheel. You hold it with your hands, so the carpals is the wrist. And then tarsals, the T goes with toes, right? So the tarsals are the ankle part, the carpals are the wrist part. The head is cephalic, the neck is cervical. The dorsum is the back. The highest part of the shoulder is the acromial. And the back of the elbow is the olecranon or olecranon. So if you're leaning on your elbows, you're leaning on a bone called the olecranon process. So that's olecranal or olecranon. Upper limb is the same thing as the upper extremity. Lower limb is the lower extremity. So you can see the lower limb is everything from the thigh down to the feet. The lower back, that's the lumbar region. The gluteal region is the rump, where the butt is. That's because we have muscles that we will be learning called the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. The back of the knee is the popliteal region. The calf is called sural. The heel is called calcaneal. One of the tarsal bones is called the calcaneus. That's your heel. And then the bottom of the foot is called the plantar surface. So the palm of the hand is palmar, and the bottom of the foot is plantar. Okay, now let's look at some of the directional terms. Superior and inferior are opposites. Anterior and posterior are opposites. And medial and lateral are opposites. Okay, let's see if we can look at, and then proximal and distal are opposites. Superficial and deep are opposites. Contralateral and ipsilateral are opposites. So let's look at these on an individual. So let's look at medial and lateral first. Okay, so you see the arrows here. We could see that medial is moving towards the midline to the belly button. And if you start at the belly button and you move away towards the thumb, we are moving laterally. If we're at the thumb and you're moving to the belly button, you are moving medially. So medial is towards the midline. Lateral is when you're moving away from midline. And again, the person is standing in anatomical position. Let's look at proximal and distal. You heard me using that word distal, just to kind of throw that word around, although you didn't know what it meant. I just wanted to utilize it a little bit in this first video. Proximal and distal are being used when we're using it in reference to a body part, like the upper limb or lower limb. Proximal is when you're moving closer to the beginning of that body part, and then distal is when you're moving furthest away. We see it at the upper and the lower extremity. All the way on the left, you see superior and inferior. When you're talking about the human body in general, moving upward is moving superiorly, moving downward is moving inferiorly. When we're talking about body parts, like the upper and lower extremity, we use the word proximal and distal. Here we could see anterior and posterior. Moving to the front of the body is anterior or ventral, and moving to the back of the body is dorsal or posterior. Moving to the head is cranially, moving to the tail is caudally. And again, in reference to the whole body, we have superior and inferior. The term ipsilateral and contralateral, if someone hurts their right shoulder and they complain of ipsilateral hand pain, then that means it's the right shoulder and right hand. If they're talking about right shoulder pain and contralateral wrist pain, then it's their right shoulder, but it is the left hand that hurts. When we talk about superficial and deep, superficial means closer to the surface. So if we're looking at the person with the naked eye, their skin, the epidermis, is superficial. And as you start moving deeper, you get to the dermis and hypodermis. Okay, looking at the 4 quadrants, we have 4 quadrants that we'll talk about, and then we have 9 regions that we'll talk about. And in both of these, you can see that there are body parts that fall under each quadrant. So when we talk about the quads, right, quad means 4. There's a right upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant. And there are body parts that fall within each quadrant. Now, these are important because in healthcare, you may have paperwork that is filled out where it may say patient came in on a level of 1 to 10. The patient came in with a pain threshold of 9. They were stooped over, grabbing the right lower quadrant. So we would think, anatomy-wise, structure-wise, what do we have in that right lower quadrant? Well, they were cramped over, they had a fever. Upon palpation, there was tenderness in the right lower quadrant. Maybe it was an appendicitis, right? Because on the bottom in the right lower quadrant is the vermiform appendix, so it could be. If they had pain in the right upper quadrant, maybe it is a gallbladder stone, gallstone. Maybe it's a problem with the liver. If it's in the left upper quadrant, maybe it could be a problem with the stomach, right? So the key is you have to know the anatomy, what structures are there. Then we have the 9 regions. And the 9 regions are taught 2 different ways. You can see in the center is the umbilical region, and then you have an epigastric and hypogastric. Epi means above, hypo means below. So epigastric is above the stomach, hypogastric below the stomach, also known as the pubic region. When we look at the umbilical region to the left, it's the left lumbar, sometimes called the left flank. Then you have a right lumbar, sometimes called the right flank. The hypogastric region or pubic region in the lower center, to the left, left inguinal, to the right, right inguinal. All the way on the top, you have the epigastric to the left, left hypochondriac region, and to the right, right hypochondriac region. I've seen this show up on a drag and drop on some of the quizzes. So again, it's literally, there'd be like an answer key with all of these terms. You hold it and you drag and drop the terms to the appropriate place. Pretty straightforward for the connect portion on the McGraw-Hill side. So again, this is a really nice picture because it really shows you the anatomy that is located here. And again, you can kind of think of it, in this case, it's 9 regions. But if you draw the line in the center and straight across, then you have your 4 quadrants. Okay, let's look at the planes. And when we talk about planes, It's really a three-dimensional axis type of thing. And we could divide the body into a sagittal plane, a coronal plane, and a transverse plane. And we utilize these really important when we talk about diagnostic imaging, whether it's a PET scan, an MRI, or even a CAT scan. So here on the right-hand side, when we look at that cut that's going from front to back is the sagittal plane. The front to back slice that separates the body into a left half and a right half is called a sagittal plane. When we have a plane that cuts the body from the slice going left to right, that separates the body into a front half and a back half, that's called the frontal plane, also known as the coronal plane. And the last slice slices the body in half at the waist, giving you a bird's eye view of everything from front to back. Okay, really good for depth. So most diagnostic imaging can take slices in all three planes. So in this case, this plane, if we go back and go, okay, it looks like it's cutting the body in half, we call this the transverse plane. If we're talking about the one right down the center, that could be the mid-sagittal plane. And then there's one that's off that could be mid-clavicular, but it's also running sagittally up and down. Okay, it's going to separate the body into a left half and a right half. It's just not equal left half and right half as the mid-sagittal plane is. And there's an oblique plane. If you look on the left, there's this funky slant, that diagonal, that's an oblique plane. So here's an image of the brain. On the top left, this is separating the body into a left and right half. That's your sagittal plane. On the right-hand side, this is separating the body into a front half and back half. That's your coronal or frontal plane. And then on the bottom, this is your transverse slice, where you could see everything from front to back, and it's a bird's eye view looking down. This one in particular is looking at the chambers, the ventricles inside the brain. Here, this was like a drag and drop where you see coronal, mid-sagittal, parasagittal, and transverse, and it was just kind of dragging the terms to the appropriate definition. So if we're looking at dividing the body into an anterior and posterior section, that's coronal or frontal. When you're looking at dividing the body into equal left and right half, that's mid-sagittal. If it's dividing the body into an unequal left and right half, those are parasagittal. And if it's dividing the body into a superior and an inferior part, right, dividing the body in half, top and bottom, bird's eye view, that's the transverse. Now, it wants to know here, if you look at the question, this is like 2 for the price of 1. What is the medial border of the highlighted region called? So you have to know, okay, lateral is outside, medial border is the inside. So what is that plane that runs up and down? That's going to be mid-sagittal. Here, what is the name of the line that makes the medial border of the highlighted region? Okay, we look at the blue section and we look at the inner part, the medial. Well, that line runs up and down, so I would be looking for maybe parasagittal or mid-sagittal, but those weren't present here. Since the line is running midway through the clavicle on the top, they were looking for mid-clavicular. Okay, so you have to critically think on some of these. Okay, and I think finishing up here, we're looking at body cavities. Body cavities are going to protect organs from accidental shock, and they permit some changes in size of the shape of the internal organs. These body cavities are separated and they're divided by a muscle called the diaphragm that I will show you. So here we have an anterior chamber and we have a posterior chamber. And in the anterior chamber, we see the thoracic cavity in the front, then we see the diaphragm, and then we have the abdominal pelvic down below. On the posterior side, they would be the brain and the spinal cord. So it'd be the cranial portion and the spinal portion. Okay. If you look around the lungs, you see pleural cavity. When you look around the heart, you see pericardial cavity. Then there's the diaphragm. Then there's the peritoneal cavity, abdominal cavity, and pelvic cavity. So if we look at the tan area on top, that's pointing to the cranial cavity. When you look at the spinal column, they would call that the vertebral cavity. Off to the right there, pointing to the spinal cord. Then when we look at the kind of greenish blue area on the left, on the top, that's surrounding the lungs, that's going to be the pleural cavity. Then you have that diaphragm, and then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity down below. So the posterior cavity, or the cranial cavity, sorry, the dorsal cavity is going to have the cranial cavity, the vertebral cavity or vertebral canal, the spinal cord, and even the meninges, right? The meninges are the layers that protect the spinal cord. In the front portion, in the ventral cavity, that's where you have the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, lungs, and the mediastinum is a unique area which is medial to both lungs. It's posterior to the sternum, but anterior to the spinal column. That area where many vessels and tubes that go in and out of the throat or into the heart, that's called the mediastinum. So here you can actually see the mediastinum. You see superior mediastinum right there in the center above the pericardial cavity. So the cranial cavity is on top where the skull is. The vertebral cavity is in the middle. Then you have the thoracic cavity, which has the lungs, the heart, and the mediastinum in it. And then down below, you've got the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So what we need to know about this, there's two important terms that I want you to understand: visceral and parietal. So on the left, surrounding the heart, you see that it says visceral pericardium, and on the bottom on the left, it says parietal pericardium. Well, look at the picture on the right. You see the fist is pushing into the balloon. The layer that comes into contact with the fist, that's called the visceral layer. And then the layer off to the right, where it says balloon, that would be the parietal layer. So if we look at the heart makes contact with a balloon. That's the visceral pericardium. Then the part that's on the outside of it would be the parietal pericardium. And then between the visceral and the parietal pericardium is the cavity where there's pericardial fluid, right? That heart is beating rapidly all day long. A muscle beating rapidly generates heat. So the pericardial cavity, if it generates too much heat. Okay, so visceral and parietal, we're going to see these terms, whether it relates to the heart. Now we just add pericardium to it. If it refers to the lungs, we add the word pleural to it. And if it involves the digestive organs, we use the word peritoneum. But visceral and parietal are going to be associated with all of them. So visceral layer is going to cover the organ. Parietal layer is going to be on the outer part of the cavity. So let's look at the heart. Again, we see the visceral pericardium. We see the parietal pericardium. And then between the two, pericardial cavity. The same concept applies to the lungs, but now we're using the word plural. So the inner part is the visceral pleura. The outer part of the lungs is that parietal pleura. And then we have the pleural cavity in between. So visceral and parietal we've seen with the lungs. Visceral and parietal we've seen with the heart. With the heart, we use the word pericardium. With the lungs, we use the word pleura. Now we have one thing left, which, oh, actually, let's go back here. What is this blue region that's highlighted? So it's the heart. It's the inner part that's closest to the organ itself. So that's the visceral pericardium. Now let's look at the peritoneum. When we talk about the abdominal pelvic region around the abdomen, we talk about peritoneum. But again, visceral peritoneum, it's going to cover the organ. Parietal peritoneum is closer to the body wall. So here in this layer, we see blue outlining the entire wall. Everything around it is blue. So that's the parietal peritoneum. If it was just blue, let's say around the liver on top, then that would have been the visceral peritoneum. One thing I want to point out is that if we look just in front of the spinal column, we see the pancreas and we see a little bit of the kidney. That's behind the peritoneum. We call it retroperitoneum. There are some organs that are behind the peritoneum. And that's why when the pancreas gets enlarged, let's say pancreatic cancer, it becomes very painful. It's a painful type of cancer because as it expands, it pushes into the peritoneum, which is very, very pain sensitive. And when you get cancers that break through that peritoneum, you can get those cancers that spread to other digestive organs. Okay, let's see, is there anything else here? We spoke about retroperitoneum. We know the diaphragm is that muscle that separates the upper chamber from the lower chamber. Let's just review that so you can see what I'm talking about. See the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. That's all I wanted to point out there. Okay. All right, let's take any questions. Let's see if you have any questions for me.